How many of us are truly conscious that God does not answer prayers exactly the way we ask Him to? In other words, there are certain things that happen unexpectedly because perhaps we did not think this was God's method or how He would act at a specific point in our lives. Allow me to tell you that the life of Joseph is filled with these type of circumstances, but it is a fascinating life. Throughout this week in this devotional, you will understand how to manage crisis in the light of the life of Joseph. Good morning, I am Pastor Carlos Rios, and this is our devotional Mana, a daily adventure with God. Join me in the book of Genesis chapter 37, where we will read the story of Joseph. Perhaps many of you have already read it or heard it, partially or completely, but for me it is very important that you understand the complete story from the beginning in order to discover the great message in this relevant life, in the life of Joseph. How can we interpret crisis in the light of a life of a man like this one? Joseph was the son of Jacob, who had many sons, but the story tells us that his first wife, the wife whom he married and whom he loved, could not bear him children. So he had other women and other children from these women. But a characteristic in the life of Joseph is that Joseph was born from the wife that he loved, his first wife, and he was born when they were at an advanced age. And so there was a special love for Joseph on behalf of his parents. And here we can begin to interpret what happens in the life of Joseph. I am in chapter 37 of the book of Genesis, verse 2. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending to the flocks with his brothers. Let's pause here for a moment and take note. It is important to understand that Joseph here was 17 years old, because I'll come back to this during this week. At the end of this text, verse 2, it says that Joseph would bring their father bad report about his brothers. Here we begin to see a type of family conflict that will have an effect in the future. Verse 3 says, now Israel loved Joseph. Remember, in other words, Jacob, because Israel became Jacob. And so whenever you hear the name Jacob or Israel, they are the same. So it says, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him an ornate robe for him. Jacob could never pretend that he was not indifferent with Joseph, and his brothers felt this. And here there's a very important detail. While his brothers used normal clothing of that time, Jacob made a tunic of diverse colors for Joseph that demonstrated preference and that he was a special son. And so, of course, this attitude of the father towards Joseph made their relationship close with the father and the son. But of course, this also caused a rivalry. And why? Because it says that Joseph would continuously bring bad report of his brothers to his father. And look at what his brothers do. Verse 4. Remember, we are reading chapter 37 of Genesis. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. And so here, from the beginning, we begin to see hostile relationships, not even just difficult, because it is very common among siblings to have arguments, discussions, but typically we love one another and embrace each other. But in this case, the hostility reached such a point that it says that they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. In addition to this, from verses 5 through 17, Joseph began to tell his father the dreams he had had. And in his dreams, he has seen that he would govern over his brothers and his entire family. And of course, yet another thing that was feeding the hate, the envy on behalf of the brothers towards Joseph. Let's go to verse 18. And verse 18 tells us that one day the father said to Joseph, go and check on your brothers, which is common among siblings. Take some food for them and tell me, when you get back, tell me how they are doing. And verse 18 of Genesis 37 says, it says that when they saw him in the distance and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. To reach an extreme like this leads us to understand that the relationship were not just bad or somewhat hostile. No, they were critical. Because if his brothers are at the point where they're conspiring to kill him, to kill Joseph, this is very serious at this point. Verse 19, it says, "Here comes that dreamer." And this is the nickname they had given him because of the dreams he had expressed, because he spoke a lot. And of course, this preference at home had generated a very grave problem. Verse 20 says, "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him." But verse 22 says that one of his brothers, Reuben, said, "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." And verse 23 says that when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, this ornate robe that always described Joseph and that always made his brothers feel inferior to Joseph and caused them so much anger. So they took away his robe and threw him in the cistern. And it says that the cistern was empty, and so they sat down to eat. And verse 5 says that they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. And so they said, "Well, we have a better idea. Let's not kill him. Let's sell him to these Ishmaelites so they can take him off to Egypt." And one of his brothers, Judah, in verse 26 says, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? No, come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him." Verse 27. Verse 28, "So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt." And in the last verse 36 of this Genesis 37, it says that the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. And so now, my dear family, let's dive into the analysis. What would you do if confronting this type of crisis filled with hate, with envy, with betrayal, with theft? How many stories I hear as a pastor each day, and we mustn't forget that we are talking about human beings here. I've heard stories of brothers and sisters, siblings who have killed one another for an inheritance, and perhaps there was a will or an agreement done before one of the parents or both parents died, but as soon as the parents die, everything changes. Some become hateful to one another and do not speak to each other for years after aggressions, betrayals, death threats, simply because of this topic of money. And even marriages, couples who love each other, who swear eternal love to one another. And from one day to the next, the same thing. Threats, betrayals, wounds, mistreatment, abuse. And this is astonishing, where we say, what is going on here when they loved each other so much? And how about those who have business partners who betray and steal from one another and conspire against each other? And so there are many, many stories to tell you, my dear family, and all of them with the common denominator. And we must not forget that crisis often starts with us as imperfect human beings in a fallen world where everyone loves money, everyone loves pleasure, power. And so I ask, how many of those who are listening to this devotional are hurt, wounded, or have a broken heart, no longer trusting life, relationships, and do not want to have dealings with other people? They do not trust other people. How many of those who are listening to this devotional have been manipulated, betrayed, robbed, where others have lied about them and tarnished their reputations, and many of these often unjustly? Are you going through a similar situation in your daily life? How many crises do we confront, do we face, and sometimes we end up blaming God or blaming ourselves, or perhaps looking for someone to blame? But today I would like for this reflection, this story that we are discussing, to first lead us to understand in the light of the life of Joseph. And so once again, pay close attention Just a few hours earlier, everything was perfect in the life of Joseph. He had a beautiful ornamental robe. He was the favorite son in the house of his father. He dreamed that his father and his siblings would raise their sights and look up to him. But what goes up must come down, and the life of Joseph abruptly fell to the ground, despised by his brothers, thrown into the depths of a empty cistern, humiliated and sold for a slave, and from there taken to Egypt. Can you believe that our life can change from one day to the next so rigorously? But here lies the point. So let's look at the background. This is why I began the devotional today saying that often God responds to our prayers in the least expected ways, or not how we expected him to. Because Joseph prayed, Joseph had a dream. And in his dream, he was going to be at the top, governing. He was going to be a very important man, but in his mind, he probably imagined that he was going to be placed on a chariot and be appointed to a special role. But no, nor was he given a special role or a promotion. Instead, the world caved in on him. From one day to the next, his life changed. I cannot imagine the scene of Joseph in a cistern. Can you imagine the scene when he is sold as a slave to some merchants? Think about this. Can you imagine Joseph tied to the side of a wagon walking hundreds of miles until reaching Egypt? Because of course he was not taken in a chariot or as a privileged person. No, he was bought as a slave, and slaves walked. And if they did not walk, they would be whipped, lashed. So imagine walking through the desert hundreds of miles until reaching Egypt. Think about what came to the mind and the heart of Joseph during these miles that he walked, saying, "My brothers sold me. My brothers did not have mercy on me." I think Joseph never fully understood the hate, the envy, and the betrayal in the hearts of his brothers towards him. And perhaps we do not understand human nature, and we cannot understand that there are people who truly want to cause us harm, who will want to remove us from the path, who will want to kill our dreams. Joseph was a man of dreams, a dreamer. And sometimes these things happen, perhaps not intentionally, because his brothers hated him, but perhaps they did not understand the graveness, the seriousness of their actions towards Joseph. And so this is why I insist, think as you listen to this devotional on your own personal situation, because I know that many are not far from having lived a similar personal situation. How many of those who are listening to this devotional today live in a different country? And when they arrived to this country, it was very difficult, because the same thing happened to Joseph. Joseph arrived in Egypt with nothing, not a single cent to his name. Joseph's name was not worth a cent. His family lineage was irrelevant. His occupation despised. Joseph had no credentials to present, nor any vocation that could be of interest to anyone, no family to lean on. He had lost everything. Now, perhaps in the depth of his heart, there was something that kept Joseph going, and this was his destiny, his dreams. And allow me to tell you, this is what we must have when confronting crisis. Because when we talk about crisis, the most important thing is to not allow anyone to take from us who we are and what we are going to achieve in Christ. There was no way Joseph could know what the future held for him. However, his dreams had told him that he would take a place of prominence amongst his family. And Joseph held on to these dreams closely, and they kept him alive. And this is what we must do during crisis. Do not try to look for who is guilty or point fingers or hate others. No, perhaps this is the path that God is using to make you who He wants you to be, to develop many things that you would have never been able to develop on your own, because this is what crisis causes. This Hebrew young man lost his family, lost his dignity, lost his home. But do you want to know something? He never lost his trust in God. Walking through that desert towards Egypt, he decided, that things would not end this way. He said, God has a dream for my life. God has a plan with my life. Perhaps as he carried these heavy chains that his new owners had placed on him, placed on slaves, he remembered, I've been called for greater things than this, and taken to a foreign city where they spoke a foreign language, where they had a different religion, a different God. He continued to believe, God has great plans for me. You and I have been chosen and set apart by God. Please, in the midst of crisis, always remember this. God has a purpose, and I must always set my sight on the eternal. Do not be trapped in short-term thoughts, because if Joseph had only thought about the short term, he would have simply cried, cursed his life, cursed his luck, and asked why he was in this situation. But he knew that this was just a phase, a step in what God had for his life. And this is what you must also remember during crisis. Your problems will not last forever, but you and what God has placed in your heart, the vision God has given you, will. Because the Bible tells us, for we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. How I love this verse, 2 Corinthians 5:1. Who cares if this body one day will perish? What's important is that I will not die eternally. I will be going to my true home, the home that the Lord prepared for me. And as we spoke last week, even when Paul went through crisis, his sights were set on his reward. One day he called his tribulations small compared to the weight of his eternal glory. And this is how a man, a child of God, never loses his or her vision. Remember, during time of crisis, never allow situations, tragedies to define you. Do not say, I am divorced, I am an addict, I am a business person now in bankrupt, I am handicapped or scarred. No, you cannot fit into this small mold, into this destiny, because you are a son, a daughter of God. Now, it is also important to not focus just on the small things that the world focuses on. Making money, making friends, making a name for yourself, developing muscles, or just what is physical. No. Think about this morning. Joseph could have said, I've lost it all. But this wasn't true. This was not true. God is working in us. God is carrying out something important in our lives. Allow God to work inside of you. Allow God to carry out the work. Do not throw in the towel. Do not give up. Do not desist so quickly. Kneel and say, Lord, I know that this has a special purpose in my life for me. Father, thank you for this morning, for the beginning of this new day. Thank you for your presence and for being with us. Thank you for your word. Today you allow us to wake up to speak to our hearts, telling us that we cannot take things personally, because perhaps we have prayed for something, but we have forgotten that God is responding to our prayers, but maybe not in the way we expected, maybe even through crisis. Perhaps they were not the response we expected, the path we expected, but God's thoughts are not the same as man's thoughts. God's ways are not the same ways as men's ways. Thank you for giving us the strength, the faith to not look back and to continue forward. Thank you for filling us with your word and with the Holy Spirit. And thank you for each listener of Mana this morning. Tell them not to give up, not to look back, to not just focus on the circumstances, and that Joseph has a great lesson for our lives in the light of all that happened in his life. We give you this day, this week, and may your presence go in front of us. We commend ourselves to you, and we ask for your blessing in Christ Jesus. And I wait for you tomorrow. Blessings to all.